Power abhors a vacuum. In the aftermath of the fall of the Bastille and Louis' submission to the National Assembly, there came about just such a void. When Paris sneezes, France catches the cold. Thus, upheaval in the capital triggered another wave of violent peasant revolts. Royal authority, kingdom-wide, was completely ruptured. Tax offices were raised, provincial governors were forcibly excised, and revolutionary committees sprung up to replace them. Peasants refused to pay taxes or tolls. Rebels blocked the roads. Manors were ransacked. Army units mutinied. Whatever authority survived attempted in vain to stem the tide, but to no avail. Often the militia and army units at their disposal, instead of quelling the uprisings, joined the massed ranks of revolutionaries, turning their muskets on their former masters. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions, of French peasants, fleeing the violence or searching for food and work, descended upon France's cities. These displaced, migratory peasant masses, listless and dejected, were vectors for agitation and conspiracy. From fevered imaginations came rumours of an insidious noble plot. Supposedly, bands of armed brigands were patrolling the roads, isolating and then robbing or killing innocent peasants on behalf of noble paymasters. Now, while it is certainly true that there would have been bandits aplenty at the time, there's no evidence to suggest that any were in the pockets of the nobles. But the mere supposition that they were caused massive panic. Villagers organised, sending out armed patrols. These patrols, then mistaken for the bandits, they were sent out to find. At spear points, seigneurs were forced to open their granaries to the serfs. In the cities, merchants, particularly those who traded in grain, were hounded until they relinquished their stock. Manorial estates, businesses, mills and workshops, wherever they were to be found, were prime targets for the peasants who torched as many noble properties as they could. In the process, they also destroyed the feudal records, which noted land ownership and taxes due by the peasants. And is so often the case, the Jewish community suffered greatly. Accosted in the streets, their homes and businesses looted. The overall result of all this was a total paralysation of the kingdom. It was a summer of few harvests and empty granaries. No taxes could be administered, no trade conducted, no communications got through. In short, fear, potent and primal, had gripped the country. This was the Great Fear. Some of the most extreme disturbances occurred in Paris. In one instance, several corrupt and popularly reviled parlementaires, who had declared that the people should be made to eat hay, were ambushed in the streets, then made to wear crowns of thorns. Their mouths stuffed with hay, each was lynched, or a lanterne. The intendant of Paris was abducted from his carriage whilst he was in the process of fleeing the city. Blamed for the bread shortages by over-provisioning the army, he was beaten to a bloody pulp. Before he too was hanged, the intendant was forced to inspect the heads of the lynched parlementaires. These shocking displays of barbarity divided public opinion sharply. But the overall trajectory was clear for all to see. The blood would not stop flowing unless drastic action was taken. Things were only about to get worse, however. To match the emergence of a power vacuum in the wake of government collapse, there came also an information vacuum, a space in which rumour, conspiracy and disinformation brewed. Abject horror at rumours of invasion by foreign troops circulated throughout the frontier cities of the East. There was talk of plots to assassinate members of the National Assembly. Queen Marie Antoinette was implicated in a plot to blow up the Hôtel de Ville, à la the gunpowder plot. This latest fusillade of bad press was the nail in the coffin for her public perception, already in the gutter after the diamond necklace affair. But by far and away, the most persistent and most powerful of all these conspiracies was the infamous grain plot. Like all good conspiracies, this one was based on a kernel of truth. According to this theory, aristocrats were hoarding away grain in personal granaries, purposefully depriving the starving peasants of desperately needed sustenance. While it's certainly true that some nobles did do this, it wasn't on a major scale, and certainly not a malignant, preordained campaign. Nonetheless, it was a popular theory among peasants of all stripes to explain the dearth of grain. Conspiracies like the grain plot spread far and wide, contributing to the general sense of horror and resentment that racked the imaginations of the peasantry. Indeed, the summer of 1789 is called the Great Fear due to the prevalence and effect of such conspiracies. Naturally, the Great Fear was catastrophic for relations between the peasantry and their aristocratic overlords. Many nobles saw the writing on the wall, and so chose to flee France. These were the famous émigrés, mostly unreconstructed royalists or absolutists. The first had been the Comte d'Artois, as we saw, who fled France for safety in Coblentz at the first sign of trouble back in June. While the Comte was merely the first, and after him went many other aristocratic families. Only the most die-hard loyalists joined Artois in the Rhineland. Most sought exile in London, Vienna, or the United Provinces, hoping to live comfortably off their incomes until the storm abated. This brain drain adversely affected all aspects of government, as many of the realm's experienced and capable administrators and army officers were lost. Bear in mind too that the émigrés invariably chose to abscond with as much of their physical wealth as possible, triggering a massive flight of capital and causing no end of grief for the Ministry of Finance. The National Assembly did not escape unscathed from the Great Fear. Their political victories and concessions were well liked, certainly, but did nothing for starving and impoverished peasants scraping by at the extremes of poverty. As far as both rural and urban peasants were concerned, the Assembly had utterly failed to meet any of their specific economic demands. They'd scarcely even addressed their concerns. To prod the Assembly in the right direction, peasants all over independently decided to not pay their taxes. Since as far back as December of 1788, tax strikes had been isolated to the east and the northeast. Now they cropped up all over as word spread, and pretty soon entire regions were producing precious little tax. And yet, even with this added financial burden, the National Assembly wasn't fussed. Concerned primarily with the plight of the bourgeoisie, the Assembly had promulgated a series of laws that served to disproportionately benefit their middle-class members. Out in the provinces, where émigré nobles had deserted vast landholdings, these middle-class urbanites bought up much of that abandoned land, enriching themselves at the peasants' expense. And even with the Ancien regime in decay, peasants were still subject to seigneurial dues owed to their absent lords who, though exiled, extracted tribute by means of much-loathed proxy agents from the farmers general. Despite promises to the contrary, provincial concerns such as these were simply ignored or overlooked, fueling dissatisfaction with the National Assembly and exacerbating the scale and intensity of the Great Fear. In such ideal conditions, dissent spread like wildfire. Municipal and metropolitan areas throughout France witnessed their own explosive insurrections. Local parlements overthrew royally appointed city councils and exiled their intendants. Revolutionary committees were set up to govern the cities, issuing stark demands to the National Assembly. Mostly run by lawyers, urban professionals, and the learned intelligentsia, these councils managed to maintain some semblance of order, often through the use of hastily formed civilian militias, which were themselves bolstered by droves of deserters. It was these committees, above all, who argued incessantly for new tax laws to be passed to replace the Ancien regime's raft of extortionate feudal levies, tithes, and dues. Some, a few, were truly revolutionary. They went a step further, organising their tax strikes and implementing local reforms. But for most, the Great Fear was excellent cover to make political ground and demand greater autonomy from Paris. Really, these committees didn't want to turn the world upside down, and so were filled with dread when the insurrectionary rural peasants destroyed feudal records and razed manors here and there. The committees fired off a flurry of letters to the National Assembly, pleading for intervention. The Assembly delivered only mild requests to peasant leaders, asking that they part from the pitchforks, pay their taxes, and cease the destruction of feudal records. Obviously, these requests were laughed away. Any attempts by the National Assembly to wrest control away from the enraged peasantry were abortive at best, counterproductive at worst. Discord within the heart of the Assembly was clearly inflicting terrible damage. The National Assembly had emerged victorious in its battles with the king, but now, ravaged by factionalism and without a clear opponent, precious little unified its disparate elements. Instead of actually knuckling down and committing to solving the fundamental, systemic and structural problems of France, the delegates had turned inwards. As a result, the Assembly was riven by division and took on a distinctly more conservative leaning. Here's how things looked. The conservative backbone of the Assembly consisted of delegates from rural France, who were particularly aggrieved by the insurrectionary peasants that now directly threatened them and their properties. Led by Jean-Joseph Meunier, they differentiated themselves from other conservative factions by supporting fairly moderate middle-lane policy, eschewing both the revolutionary radicalism from the liberals and the reactionary uber-conservatism of the royalists. Nonetheless, they had made powerful allies among the arch-conservatives of the old nobility and the robed clergy. All told, Meunier's conservative movement was all about constitutional monarchy led by an empowered king there to enforce the traditional social order. A social order that both favoured them and prevented further insurrections like those of July and August. It was for this reason that the self-styled monarchies had been the ones to successfully push for the National Assembly's few limp-wristed attempts at containing the peasants. Making great hay of Louis' submission, monarchies had the influence and the majority to direct the Assembly towards their agenda. This control was achieved by a centralised, small executive committee which was used to grant offices to monarchine candidates and determine which policy should be supported and which opposed. But their success bore a double edge. With their streak of successes, it was not long before the monarchine became synonymous with the National Assembly, and thus blamed for all its failures and empty promises. Profoundly unpopular, the monarchine pissed away all the trust the public had in the National Assembly. Indeed, it was this breakdown in public trust that scuppered any attempts at reining in the rampaging mobs. Even in spite of their ascendancy, the monarchine didn't get off scot-free. They still squared off with a sizable liberal contingent. Liberal elements had spearheaded all of the pivotal revolutionary moments thus far: the tennis court oath, the formation of the Assembly itself, the submission of the king. These successes, however, didn't translate into direct political power, able to be wielded in the Assembly. Liberals were generally outnumbered and outpoliticked, or otherwise transitioned into conservatism like Meunier had. That being said, liberals had a secret weapon: populism. Name one popular revolutionary of this time, and he was in the liberal orbit for sure. Mirabeau was one such widely acclaimed delegate, so too was the Marquis de Lafayette. The people loved them as, in their minds, liberal delegates were the ones fighting for the common man within the halls of power. Readily adopting this populist mantle, liberals fiercely advocated for the peasants. The best way to protect them would be to determine basic rights applicable to all of them. So this is what the liberals did. Such basic rights, they claimed, ought to underpin the Constitution. So this is what the liberals did. This cause blossomed into the darling of the liberal sphere, a cause which they could argue justified the upheavals triggered by the Estates General. After heated debate, the National Assembly agreed on their session of August 4th to draft this Bill of Rights, though not necessarily that it would be a part of the Constitution. It was a rare victory for the liberals. Their sphere was otherwise unsuccessful, disjointed and disorganised as they were. This was not an integrated, centralised bloc like the monarchine. More accurately, the liberals could be described as a loose confederacy of like-minded circles, clubs and delegations. Among the most revolutionary of these affiliates was the Breton delegation. Finding common ground with their Parisian colleagues, the delegation formed a proper political club, inducting like minds into their fold. Around the Breton Club coalesced the radical wing of the liberal sphere, the nucleus of the revolutionary faction that will later come to the forefront of national politics. For now, however, despite their division, monarchine and liberals shared a larger vision: political revolution that didn't spill out into social revolution. Both were constitutionalist, and did not even question the sanctity of the monarchy. Both wanted a reduction of feudal privileges, economic reform, secularization of state, meritocracy, civil liberties, press freedom, free trade, You know, the usual liberal agenda. Where they differed was on just how far to go, and as we shall see, just how comprehensive and radical the new constitution should be. The more radical revolutionary liberals wanted to go as far as possible. The total abolition of feudalism, wealth-based taxation, the abolition of tithes, separation of church and state, suspension of venal offices, an independent judiciary, and so on. For many monarchines, this was too much to ask for. Like the monarchines, the liberals were alarmed by the destruction of property and feudal records. The great fear had to end. It was the Breton Club, meeting in the Café aux Maries in Versailles, that paved the path to placation. On the night of August 4th, riding high on the day's political victory, they officially and publicly renounced their feudal oaths and privileges, essentially removing themselves from the feudal order. These renunciations were largely symbolic, but technically reduced them to a level no higher than the peasants. More specifically, these noblemen renounced their seigneurial privilege, thereby abolishing serfdom on the properties they owned. Again, this was largely symbolic. Already, serfdom was on the wane in late 18th century France. Louis himself had abolished serfdom on all crown lands some years prior, in fact. What was really actually revolutionary was their proposals for economic reform. Finally, somebody in the assembly actually, properly pushing for economic reform. The Bretons wanted to implement a massively expanded version of Calonne's programme of 1787. As far as they were concerned, such radical reform was the only fix for the French economy. Everywhere it was to be found, privilege and exemption were to be eliminated. No more venal offices or church tithes, no more tax exemptions for the nobility, no seigneurial dues owed by the peasants. An end to the Byzantine system of exemptions and deferments made to the kingdom's towns and cities. It might seem extreme, even out of the blue, to push for such a total restructuring of the kingdom's social and economic institutions. And it is, to be sure, but bear in mind two things. One, these decrees were being made under duress. Even the radical Breton delegation was acting mostly to appease the peasantry, to take the wind out of their sails, and not out of any desire to legislate a social revolution to accompany their political revolution. And two, all of the decrees were very much in line with the liberal project. There would be equality before the law, civil rights for all Frenchmen, and uniformity of taxation. During the next session for the Assembly, a spokesperson for the Breton Club announced a proposal for new tax laws which stipulated a taxation proportionate to income and assets. In other words, a wealth tax that would fully replace the ancien regime's regressive and arcane taxes and dues. We've seen proposals for a wealth tax floated before, but invariably they were dead on arrival. This tax, however, had broad popular support. Riding this wave of popular support, the Bretons hoped to capitalise on that popularity and push through the wealth tax, no matter how badly the monarchines protested. Such a move would, hopefully, mollify the peasants, causing them to restart their tax payments, and also propel the Breton Club to heady new political heights. Like so many well-laid plans, this one didn't go quite as expected. So on the day of, the spokesperson was interrupted by an arch-liberal who had caught wind of details of the wealth tax. From his soapbox, he posited the plan himself, stealing the Breton thunder. Oh well, so be it. They pressed on, 3 delegates delivering pre-arranged speeches, each playing to themes of self-sacrifice, national good, and patriotic duty. The speeches built to a triumphant crescendo as several non-Breton delegates voiced their approval. Others followed suit until pretty well the entire assembly, including many in the Conservative bloc, were in agreement. The result was a 16-point proclamation that called for the abolition or decimation of most feudal privileges. The points also got rid of road tolls, the excise tax, exclusive hunting rights, church tax exemption, serfdom, venal offices, and tithes. In addition, they laid the groundwork for a meritocratic civil service. Unreservedly, this was a seminal moment in the history of the revolution thus far. The fundamental underpinnings of the Ancien Regime's feudal structure, privilege, unequal taxation, classism, serfdom, and absolutism, scrutinized through the prisms of humanism, rationalism, and Enlightenment idealism, had been found lacking. And here was the culmination of that project. Specific empirical implementations aimed at eradicating the ancien regime, root and stem. In neat and splendid phrases were the laws, taxes and repeals that would usher in the first sweeping changes of the revolution. Almost every single delegate, be they a noble, member of the bourgeoisie, a priest, an academic, a lawyer, whoever, stood to lose by these changes. Leaving the hall literally worse off than when they entered was no small ask. Both out of a sense of desperation, to curb the great fear, but also out of a genuine sense of enlightened reasoning, did many of the delegates make such a momentous decision. How else to view it? The National Assembly's refusal to abandon their privileges and prerogatives had been the essential source of conflict between them and the king. Now, to so willingly and publicly reject them can only be viewed as an act of supreme self-sacrifice. But it's worth saying that the August decrees were a step, not a leap. The Bretons, in formulating the August decrees, were taking the wind out of the people's sails, as much heading off social revolution as enacting their enlightened liberal project. Still, consider this from the perspective of a French peasant. A year before, in the summer of 1788, you're tired, poor and hungry. You have few rights, and these rights vary place to place. You pay taxes and dues and tithes, the money never to be seen again. Harvests are poor, food is expensive. You have no money, you have tattered clothes, and to top it all off, you have no control over any of this. Now, a year later, materially little has changed. But politically, psychologically, emotionally, a lot has. You're now a recognised component of the state. You have value as a taxpayer and a worker. A year is a long time in a revolution, and the people have proven time and time again to be a revolutionary force. Their needs were no longer insignificant and ignorable. These needs were now of vital concern, pivotal to the success of any French government going forward. And woe betide any French government that got between the people and their newly granted rights. Louis's response to the August decrees was mixed. The actual content was not too unpalatable to him. Much of it was stuff he and Calonne had framed in 1787. So he was not unsympathetic to the August decrees when President Bailly commended him to endorse them publicly. What he took objection to was the precedent, more than anything. Citing some objectionable points, Louis refused to publicly endorse the August decrees. Even without the king's endorsement, the Assembly reconvened to rationalise and formalise the 16 points of the decrees on August 11th. There was a more reserved and level-headed appraisal of the points this time. Serfdom in all its forms had been abolished outright by the decrees. That meant an end to the corvée and to tithes. The peasants of France were no longer serfs, but that did not mean that all ties to the seigneurs were severed. Peasants were thus freed from all seigneurial dues, but had to pay out compensation to the landowners for dues related to the harvest. And this really sets the trend with the revisions to the August decrees. They entirely favoured the rights, specifically the property rights, of the nobility and other landowners. That being said, all their privileges and exemptions were now null and void. To that end, the National Assembly produced a set of legal steps that nobles could follow in order to divest themselves of their feudal rights and privileges. In order to get the nobility to go along with this plan, the legal steps promised compensation, usually financial, for the loss of income and property. So materially, most of the delegates didn't suffer for their renunciation of their nobility. Still, their apparent self-sacrifice had the desired effect. Having learned that the nobles of the Assembly had renounced their nobility and enacted steps to abolish serfdom and feudal privilege, the peasants were well pleased. The tyranny of the nobility was at an end. Feeling as though they were being heeded, most returned to their fields, manufactories, and other work, sated for now, though not fully satisfied. Taxes were still not forthcoming, to be fair, but for the most part, it seemed that the upheaval of the past few weeks was drawing down. By the end of August, the Great Fear was over. Minor uprisings and pockets of resistance persisted for the rest of the summer, but mostly petered out by the end of the year. The kingdom seemed set on a course to renewed stability.